Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The CFL, the Canadian Football League, that season is underway as training camps have opened. And while here in the U.S., I concentrate more on the stories of the forgotten heroes, teams, and events more relatable to us, there are still great stories elsewhere. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, I'm going to discuss one of the great forgotten stories of the CFL. The first Western City team to win the Grey Cup, a team simply known as the Winnipegs.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
The Winnipegs are better known as the Blue Bombers. At first, however, they didn't have a nickname and were just known as the Winnipegs. And in 1935, they did something that no other team based in Western Canada had ever done: win the Grey Cup. And not only did they win the Grey Cup, they also became the first Western City team to beat an Eastern City team ever in the history of the CFL. And it wasn't easy. You see, the Winnipegs struggled. They had a roster of good football players, but not as strong as their Eastern counterparts. So, what did they do to overcome their lack of talent? Today, I think their course of action might be frowned upon, but back in the 1930s, it wasn't. They went out and signed American-bred football players, several of them. Guys like Joe Perpich, Bert Oja, Herb Peschel, Bud Marquardt, and Bob Fritz, to name a few. The American influence was welcomed by many, and it turned the fortunes of the team around. In fact, in 1935, the Winnipegs went 11-0 and beat Hamilton in the Grey Cup 18-12. It was an important moment in CFL history to finally have a Western City team win the championship. Overall, Winnipeg has won the Grey Cup 9 times, and Edmonton, another Western City team, has won it more than any other with 11 championships. Of course, the CFL was set up very differently than it is today, and we're going to discuss that with RC Ryan Christiansen, who recently released a very detailed book about the origins of the Winnipegs and the journey they took to that first championship in a book called Border Boys. Before we do, however, a few notes for you. Sports Forgotten Heroes is a proud member of the Sports History Network. This is a conglomerate of many sports history podcasts running the gamut, from Sports Forgotten Heroes to football-specific podcasts, basketball-specific podcasts, other sports history podcasts. Heck, there's even a race car-specific podcast, and a lot more. Check it out at sportshistorynetwork.com. Of course, don't forget to check out my website, sportsfh.com. Here's where I have more information about the topics I discuss. Also, If you have an idea for a podcast or want to drop me a note, please do so at sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. In fact, this is how Ryan Christiansen, today's guest, got a hold of me, and after a little bit of research, decided to do this podcast. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook, and please give Sports Forgotten Heroes a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. As always, thank you for your support. Okay, let's get into today's show about the Winnipegs with my guest, RC, or Ryan Christiansen. Ryan, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could join us.
Oh, and I'm glad to be here. You have a great podcast, and now I'm going to hear myself on the podcast, which is always kind of an eerie experience, I think.
It's helped Western Canada to win a football championship. Where did the idea to write such a book come from?
Well, of course, people who are interested in Canadian football, we always see that there's a lot of American players on those teams. And I was up in Canada in 2018. I was at a Winnipeg Blue Bombers game. I'm from Fargo, North Dakota.
Okay.
We live approximately the same distance from Winnipeg as we do from Minneapolis. And yeah, so I had decided that, I could be a Winnipeg Blue Bombers fan too, because I wanted to, increase my interest in the Canadian game. And I thought there wasn't a better way to do it than to actually go up there instead of just watching all the streaming availability. So I went up to a game, took my family up there, and actually went to a few games that year. But we were at this particular game, they were playing Montreal Alouettes, and at halftime, they inducted someone new into their Ring of Honor. And at the time, I happened to be wandering around the concourse looking for a beer or beers for me and my wife. And I was actually disappointed because I was looking for Canadian beer and all they had was Budweiser. But anyways, I get back to my seat and I missed the whole halftime thing. But my wife said, "Did you know they just inducted someone into the Ring of Honor who had played at North Dakota State University?" And of course, that's the big Division I multi-year champion here in Fargo, North Dakota. And so I said, "Well, who was it?" She said, "Well, some guy named Fritz Hansen." And I'm like, "Never heard of him." And so when we returned home, I had already joined the Professional Football Researchers Association, I think maybe a year before. And so I thought, well, maybe I could get an article out of this. And so I looked into it. And as soon as I started looking into it, I'm like, how do I not know about Fritz Hansen? Because he's in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. He's in the inaugural class of the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. So, in other words, at that point, they said, well, geez, if we have anyone in the Hall of Fame, Fritz Hansen has to be there. So, so I was just intrigued and just stupefied. Why don't I know about this guy? And then while looking into Fritz Hansen, using the wonderful tools that we have nowadays, I'm searching newspapers and things, I'm running across this other Fritz name. And another guy, and his name Bob Fritz. So we got Fritz Hansen, and then there's Bob Fritz. And the thing about Bob Fritz is I knew the name Bob Fritz because I grew up in Moorhead, Minnesota, across the river here from Fargo. And there was a Bob Fritz Sporting Goods and while I was growing up. And so I thought, wow. So Bob Fritz was part of this too. And then what I figured out in short order is that there were 3 players from North Dakota State University and 1 from Concordia College in Moorhead that all went up there together to play for the Winnipeg team in 1935, and they ended up winning the Grey Cup. And so from there, I couldn't stop. I just kept doing my research, and the result is
I'm guessing that
quite a thick
several of
tome
you, like
of facts.
I'll place a little bet on your favorite team. Well, I'm asking for a favor. I recently found a great online site for placing bets. It's called betus.com. They have tons of bonuses for you if you sign up, beginning with a 125% sign-up bonus if you use the code SPORTSFH10. That's SPORTSFH10. Just go to betus.com or call 800-MY-BET-US. That's 800-MY-BET-US. Or again, go to betus.com. NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, player props, UFC matches, horse racing, golf, you name it. It's all there on betus.com. Use the promo code SPORTSFH10 and you'll get a 125% sign-up bonus. So, if you like to place a wager here and there, follow my lead and get your phone or go online like I did to betus.com. You bet, you win, you get paid. betus.com. And remember, use the promo code SPORTSFH10 for a 125% sign-up bonus. And yeah, this podcast gets a little, and thanks for your support. Yeah, your book really does dive in deep, and we're going to explore some of that. And, you know, some of the origins, I think, of the Blue Bombers, of the CFL itself. And one thing we need to do right off the bat, and maybe I just misunderstood how the CFL was originally formatted, we'll say, how it was set up. So back in the early 1930s, during the period you wrote about, I'm really confused on this point. Was it a football league or was it a rugby league? I'm not sure I understand that. At what point, why was it called rugby? Can you clear that up for me?
Sure. Well,
Right.
as most people who follow football history know, both American and Canadian football originated with rugby, and it went through Canada to America, right? So the origin is actually from Canada to the United States, and then these two systems sort of diverged. But they not just diverged, but they crossed over and influenced one another over time.
Okay.
Well, in Canada, it took them until 1929 to even try using the forward pass. And they also, even through the course of this book through 1935, they pretty much didn't allow much blocking at all. Early on, there was no blocking, like in rugby, but there was very limited blocking at the time that I'm writing this book. So in Canada, it was much more rugby-like until 1929, but especially in 1931 when they finally worked out all the kinks and got a forward pass
I
in
guess
place
that's where
that
my
was
confusion
pretty much
came
like
from,
the American
because
forward pass.
you reference rugby quite often.
But they still called it rugby for the most part.
I was like, all right, so I'm not understanding this. So, but now I do. Thank you for clearing that up.
Well, and I'm going to be probably saying rugby still when we talk, because even though they had adopted
They were rugby
largely
clubs.
calling the game football by this time, the
Understood.
organizations
So,
within
Ryan, your
Canada
book
that oversaw the
certainly
different games
goes way
still
back.
had.
I mean,
Yeah,
back
there
to
were still
really
rugby in the
the
name.
origins
So
of the Canadian Football League. But we're going to concentrate mostly on 1935. You know, it was really a special year because for the first time, a team from Western Canada won the Grey Cup, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Now, of course, I'm calling them the Blue Bombers because that's who they are today, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. But that's not what they were known as back then. So what were they known as, and what were they known as, and when did they become the Blue Bombers?
no, they didn't get the. Yeah, they didn't get the. Yeah, so they actually became the Blue Bombers the next year after they won the Grey Cup in 1935. So, and they didn't. I don't know when they officially became the Blue Bombers, but one of the sports writers in a Winnipeg newspaper began calling them the Blue Bombers,
Joe
sort of
Louis,
in
sure.
reference to, in allusion to the Brown Bomber boxer.
Right.
I believe his name was Joe Lewis.
Winnipeg, so they were the Winnipegs, but there were other teams in the
but they
area.
were just called the Winnipegs.
And one of them was, I'm going to try to say this correctly, the Winnipeg Tammany Tigers. Did I say that right? Tammany?
Yeah, the Winnipeg Tammany Tigers were the precursor to the Winnipegs, and so the Winnipeg Tammany Tigers. I don't know
before
how
we
far
jump
back
there,
they go exactly, but they actually did compete in the Grey Cup in 1925 against
for the
Ottawa
Winnipeg
Senators.
community
And they-
itself, and we're going to get to 1925 in a second. It was a long journey for them to get their hands on that Grey Cup. But for the Winnipegs themselves, now for the community, like I said, it was a long journey. But for the Winnipegs or the Blue Bombers, it really wasn't. The team itself was founded in 1930, and then just 5 years later, they win the Grey Cup. But again, it was a long journey for the community of Winnipeg. So let's start with, I'm going to call them the Tigers because Tammany's going to mess me up here. Who were they and what happened to that team? Yes, sir.
To the Tammany Tigers? Yeah, well, they actually they pretty much changed their name officially to the Winnipeg Rugby Club, and then just called themselves the Winnipegs, and then adopted at that time the colors green and white. And as far as I can tell, there is a direct line from the Tammany Tigers to the Winnipeg Rugby Club, but the Winnipeg Blue Bombers don't recognize the Tammany Tigers because they are outside of being part of their organization in the official CFL lineage or something like that. But the Tammany Tigers, were the direct ancestor
They
of
somehow
Winnipeg
became
Rugby
a part
Club.
of the rugby club, and the rugby club ultimately became the Winnipegs and then the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Is that how that worked?
Right. And one of the, excuse me, one of the through lines through all of this is a gentleman named Lou Edelman. His nickname was Rosie Edelman. He actually played for the Winnipeg Tammany Tigers, and on that 1925 Grey Cup team that lost to the Ottawa Senators, and he was on the Winnipeg team when they won the 1935 Grey Cup, and I think he was there for a couple of years after that as well.
Okay.
So he was playing on that Winnipeg
there
team
is a
with that
connection
kind of through line there
probably
for 17
a couple
years.
Other players too. Let me ask you this. Why was it so difficult for the Tigers and other clubs from Western Canada to win the Grey Cup? Why were the Western teams, I hate to use the word inferior, but when it came to the Grey Cup, Western Canada was inferior to Eastern Canada? Why?
Well, it mostly has to do with, just like in the United States, we had westward expansion. And of course, that was the same thing in Canada. And so early on in Canadian football, you had an organization of football teams in Quebec, and you also had an organization in Ontario. And that's about as far west as things went. But then over the years, Manitoba started their own organization. These are all called unions. They formed the Manitoba Rugby Football Union, and then it just headed west. It was Saskatchewan, and then Alberta, and then British Columbia. They all formed their own rugby football unions, they called them. And so because of that, the population centers, of course, were in the east. So were most the major universities, and people would go to college in the east, and they might play rugby football at one of the colleges there, and then they would stay, right? They would live and stay in the area, and then they would end up playing for one of the club teams afterward. Okay. And so the talent was really concentrated in the east, and it just
to the championship game in just a short time ago.
It made for better teams in the east.
You did refer to the Tigers, who made it to the championship game in 1925. But they got thumped by Ottawa, the Ottawa Senators, 24-1. Obviously disappointing, a disappointing outcome. Do you know what happened in that game? Were they just that overmatched? Was there any sense of accomplishment?
They were overmatched. I never did look into the details of that game, but I know in the aftermath that Rosie Adelman, one of the things that he recalled was how the newspapers afterward called the Tammany Tigers a bunch of intermediates. And so what that means is in the system of rugby football at the time, you had junior level, and then you had intermediate level, and you had the senior level teams. And the senior level teams are all the ones that competed for the Grey Cup. And senior level teams, by the way, included university
teams. But let's fast forward to 1935. So we sort of talked about that there was a team, the Tammany Tigers. There was, the rugby club. The Tigers were no more. Out of that came the Winnipegs. The Winnipegs really came about in 1930, and by 35, they became a pretty good team. And what I'd like to do is play a little name association with you. I'm going to mention a player's name, and you're going to tell us a little bit about that player, where they played their college ball, why they decided to play in the CFL instead of the NFL, how they ended up with Winnipeg. Those are some of the things that if you want to recall and tell us about, that would be great. And Let's start with a guy who you already talked about. Where did he come from? Tell us a little bit about him, Rosie Adelman.
Rosie Adelman, he's a Winnipeg native, and I apologize though, but I don't know a whole lot more about Rosie Adelman except that he had played on the Winnipeg Tammany Tigers team as well. One of the things when it comes to
Well,
the
let's talk about
Canadian
Bob Fritz.
players,
Tell
I
us a
wasn't
little
able
bit
to
more
find
about
out
Bob
quite as much
Fritz.
information about them as I wanted to. On the American side, though, I was able to find quite a bit more. Okay, so Bob Fritz, he's from International Falls, Minnesota, and he actually grew up playing on the same basketball team in high school as
It's a
Bronco
name that's
Nagurski.
still spoken about today.
And of course, Bronco Nagurski went off to fame, right? So at the University of Minnesota, right? Well, anyways, he played basketball with him there, and I think he was 1 year behind Bronco, but then he went to Concordia College, and he played on the freshman team at Concordia College in 1929. And then I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I think it was finances, because it seems to be a theme with Bob Fritz that he had some financial trouble paying for college. And of course, remember, this was the Big Great Depression. So it wouldn't be a surprise if anyone had trouble paying for something. So, but he returned then home to International Falls. His dad was a superintendent at a sawmill. And he's listed, Bob Fritz is, in the census as having worked at a sawmill. So I assume he was a hired hand there. But then he came back in 1931 to Concordia College, and he played varsity. And so here he is, 22 years old already, and he's starting his first varsity year at Concordia College. Now, he played at Concordia College he actually played 5 years at Concordia College, and it's because of how the conference, the Minnesota Intercollegiate Athletic Conference, was struggling to figure out what they needed to do to determine who's eligible or not. And he just sort of, found his way through the loopholes and played 5 years. And part of it is because the first 3 years he played at Concordia, he only attended college in the fall when he was also playing football. So he played at Concordia College, and he helped Concordia College to 2 conference championships. And he was also every single year as varsity player, 31, 2, 3, and 4. He was, all conference and all that. And so one of the interesting things about Bob Fritz is that he was ambidextrous, and he could throw or kick from either side of his body. And it actually helped him because in one of those seasons,
awesome.
He broke his hand. So he just kept playing, and he just threw with the other hand. So, yeah. So, so Bob Fritz, he goes through all that time at Concordia, and Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, which is across the river from Fargo, North Dakota. Every year they would open their season and they would play against North Dakota State University. And so Bob Fritz became really familiar with those guys at North Dakota State University while he was playing. And so, but part of this story, though, is that Bob Fritz at Concordia, for 2 years, the Concordia team, while Bob Fritz was there, would go up to Winnipeg. And they would play against the Winnipeg Rugby Club, the precursor to be calling the Blue Bombers, right? And so in those years, 1933 and 1934, the crowd in Winnipeg saw Bob Fritz, and he was really appealing to them because he was really commanding on the field, and he barked out his signals. And of course, he's ambidextrous, and he's a big fullback. And of course, at that time, the fullback would play more like a quarterback, but also run the ball. So he was a big line plunger, but he was also fast, and he played great defense, and he caught the eye of the Winnipeg organization. And so before the 1935 season, the Winnipeg organization had decided, we need to go full bore on getting Americans on our teams. We want to win a Grey Cup. And so Bob Fritz was the first guy they approached because they were familiar with him. And then, of course, Bob Fritz knew the guys at NDSU. And then the Winnipeg team had played a bunch of other guys, organizations as well.
Understood.
And so
and
there's
again,
different
we're
stories for
talking
different
about
guys. But
the border
yeah, so
boys,
Bob Fritz found his way up there because he had actually
guys
played up there with Concordia College
US
against
who
Winnipeg.
ended up in Canada and helped the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, or the Winnipegs, win the Grey Cup in 1935, the first ever Western Canadian team to win the Grey Cup. How about Bud Marquardt?
Okay, Bud Marquardt is from Moorhead, Minnesota. So when he attended NDSU in Fargo, he didn't have to go very far. And he played on championship basketball teams at Moorhead High School. He was a really good basketball player at center. And then he played end at North Dakota State University. And that's kind of, we see that nowadays, right? We see tight ends who are former basketball players, right? And so while he was at North Dakota State University, he was well known for his ability to run down punts before the returner could get very far. So he was a gunner on those situations. But he was also really good at receiving as well and defending, right? Because you played both ways back then. So he would play good pass defense. And so he played with North Dakota State University. They had a championship in that one season. It was the 1932 season that North Dakota State had a championship while he was there. And he was part of that group that Bob Fritz sought out when it came time to find more players.
Tell us a little bit about the recruitment of Fritz Hansen, the guy who ultimately led you to writing this book. He was just hanging out in a bar in, I think you said, Dilworth, Minnesota. Winnipeg's manager, a guy by the name of Joe Ryan, got Hansen to sign with the team. Tell us a little bit about Fritz Hansen and the recruitment of Fritz Hansen.
Sure. Well, Fritz Hansen, his real first name is Melvin, but his nickname was Fritz, which wasn't confusing to me at all when I'm trying to write this book, of course. But he did go by Fritz, and that's how he is in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame, and so Fritz Hansen he is. But he grew up in Perham, Minnesota, which is about an hour east of Moorhead, Minnesota. And when he played their high school ball, there was one game where he had scored 11 touchdowns. And I wasn't able to get more than secondhand information that was an 11 touchdown game, but it's very plausible that he did because he was just, it is, but he was just a little guy and he was really fast, and, little running backs are hard to tackle. And so he, and that team that year when they said he scored 11 touchdowns, his team outscored, they scored 277 points in 8 games. And so, there was quite a few points scored for the team. Yeah. Well, anyways, he came to North Dakota State University by way of his track accomplishments, because he was at the Minnesota State High School track meet where he won the 100-yard dash in 10.1 seconds, which at that time was only a tenth of a second short of a state record. So he was really fast. But he had also participated in track meets in Fargo, as did Bud Marquardt. So I failed to mention that earlier. But Fritz Hansen competed in track meets where he was probably seen by the coach there at North Dakota State University. In fact, I believe he met with Coach Casey Finnegan after the track meet there at NDSU. And then he was recruited to North Dakota State University. While he was at North Dakota State, he was used quite intelligently, I think, by Coach Finnegan, because he was a fast little guy. But Coach Finnegan would not start him because he wanted the other team to wear out first. And so, they'd faced another team that maybe was heavier overall than his team. And so he would keep Fritz Hansen out of the game until the other side got a little tired. And then he'd put this speedster in there and they just didn't know what to do with him. And so he had great success at North Dakota State University with some really long runs. He was also a passing halfback. And he became quite famous within a short period of time at North Dakota State University for North Dakota State University fans. And so, again, Bob Fritz had played against Fritz Hansen. And so, like you said, he told him, this is where Fritz Hansen hangs out. I'm assuming that's what he said, because Joe Ryan shows up at the bar where Fritz Hansen is. And Fritz Hansen is sitting there with a drink sitting on the piano and asks him, hey, do you want to come to Canada? Now, yes. So what happened was Fritz Hansen was actually also recruited by, and it's not clear, but at least one NFL team. And it sounds like there could have been up to 3 different NFL teams going after him. But he had received a contract from one of them, and he looked it over, and his mother looked it over, and his mother said, I don't know, Melvin. These guys in the contract say they can just cut you at any time. And yeah, it's good money, but I don't know. Maybe you should listen to this Joe Ryan guy from Winnipeg, because it turns out in Winnipeg, they offered him basically the same amount of money, but they said that, there would be no cuts. But the weird thing to me, Warren, is that there was no contract with Winnipeg. It was a handshake deal, and Fritz Hansen went with
one more
Winnipeg
to talk
and
about.
not with the NFL.
There were a few guys obviously on the team. There was Joe Perpich, who went to St. Cloud State. You talk about, I know I'm not going to get this name right, Bert Oja or Bert Oja, who went to Minnesota. Herb Peschel, North Dakota State. But I would like for you to talk about Greg Cabot. Yeah, I was going to call him Cabot, but I'm going with Cabot for right now.
Okay. Greg could be Cabot, could be Cabot. I honestly don't know how to say his last name. Okay. So I'll say Cabot then as well. So Cabot is from the University of Wisconsin. And so he had played at Wisconsin alongside another player named Russ Rebels. And Russ Rebels was, I think, a year or two ahead of him. I can't remember what the distance was. But Russ Rebels had actually been brought up to Winnipeg ahead of Greg Cabot. And so Russ Rebels was the first American player coach for the St. John's Rugby Football Club, which was one of the other Winnipeg teams early on. And Russ Rebels made his way to the Winnipeg club when St. John's folded, and then Rebels helped Winnipeg seek out Cabot and brought him up there. And honestly, I don't know a whole lot about Greg Cabot before that time, but I'll tell you
Right,
a real
you called it the
interesting thing about
flying
him.
wing.
He was a lineman, but sometimes he would carry the ball out of a position. And of course, it's a 12-man team in Canadian football. The flying wing. Sometimes he would carry the ball on the flying wing, which was essentially the fifth backfielder, right? And but mostly he played on the line, but he was also the place kicker. But he was also extremely nearsighted, and whenever he would kick a place kick, they would actually lay a tape. They called it a tape. I don't know what they actually laid on the field, but they laid like basically a directional marker on the field for him, so he knew what direction to kick the ball. Yeah.
Hey, Ryan,
and he also threw passes.
First of all, those are the the Americans.
Yeah, I don't
those
know.
are
They
the
had a lot
border
of
boys
trust.
that really went up to Winnipeg and made a difference. Now, we're also talking about a time when, the NFL was really still, I don't want to say in its infancy, but it was still at a time that it was establishing itself. CFL was around at that time, obviously, as well. I don't know if you can answer this, though. What was the competition like for players between the NFL and the CFL? Was the NFL the dominant league at this point, or were the two leagues on somewhat of equal footing?
Well, there actually was no CFL at that time. At the time, it was still a system where every province had its own union, their own rugby football union. And all of them rolled up into what was called the Canadian Rugby Union. And the way they played it was a competition ultimately for the Grey Cup, between East and West. And with the West starting in Manitoba, going west, and then everything else, obviously, to the east, part of the East. Each union, it's interesting though, because when we talk about leagues, we're talking about assembling certain teams belonging to an organization, and they all play one another. Well, that wasn't actually the case when you talked about these rugby football unions, because the rugby football unions in different communities and in different, depending on what the setup is, they oversaw rugby football at all levels in their communities or provinces. And so that leads, though, to one of the interesting things I've mentioned before. We have junior level, intermediate level, and senior level. That led to this interesting situation where the colleges actually played the club teams at the senior level. And so early on, there were times when a university team would play a club team for the Grey Cup. But that fell off around this time, because the university teams, although they might have been up to some of their own shenanigans trying to get players on their teams, they weren't outright paying players.
And then
like the club
sometimes,
teams were, to bring up these Americans and all that. And so they just couldn't compete
if they
anymore.
played an American team, an NFL team, you would play NFL rules one half, Canadian rules the second half. I mean, sometimes, and the fields weren't even all the same size.
No, the Canadian rules, they still use the 110-yard field, but of course, now when we talk about rule systems, they played if they played an American team, it was usually an American college team, and they played by American intercollegiate rules. And so, which was the same as NFL rules until 1933. Then in 1933, the NFL departed from the intercollegiate rules. Yeah, but they so they would. There was, especially in Winnipeg, because what happened was by 1933, Winnipeg had no more local opponents because they. They still had a team called Garrison, which was the Garrison. It was the soldiers from the Royal Armed Forces there. But the other teams that had formed the nucleus of what they called the Winnipeg Senior League, which included the Winnipeg Rugby Club, St. John's Rugby Football Club, the University of Manitoba. The University of Manitoba had stopped playing rugby football. St. John's Rugby Football Club, which had been the dominant team up until they folded, they had ceased operations as well. And so in order to have any competition, the Winnipeg club had to play teams from the United States. They had to seek out contests against college teams down in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota.
How important
to just
was
fill out a
the
schedule.
1935 season for Winnipeg? I mean, you're talking a team that's got to go and search for opponents on occasion, as you just said. It just didn't seem like the team was drawing very huge crowds. In fact, the big crowd was maybe 2,000 people. What kinds of crowds were Eastern teams drawing, and was there ever a threat of Winnipeg folding up?
Absolutely. So the numbers in the East, were a good 5 times as many as would show up on a good day in Winnipeg. But in Winnipeg, they had a lot of trouble attracting a crowd, and part of that is because the team in the West that had been so dominant for so long was actually the Regina Rough Riders, which is the precursor to today's Saskatchewan Rough Riders. And Regina was basically seen as the team in the West. Fans gravitated towards those games. When Regina came to Winnipeg, they filled the stands, right? Because that was, they were the big guns. So they wanted to see that team. But Winnipeg had a hard time attracting interest in their teams locally. The way it got turned around, though, was in 1931 when they hired a guy named Joe Ryan. And so Joe Ryan, he went to the University of Manitoba Law School and dropped out, and then he ended up living in the United States for a while. He was a bookkeeper for his mother's cousin in a logging camp in northern Wisconsin. And so while he was there, his the person he was working for said, "Hey, would you like to go see a Notre Dame football game?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, sure." So he got tickets and took a train down to see Notre Dame play. And after that, that was in 1924. And after that, he fell in love with Notre Dame football and, of course, American intercollegiate football in general. Well, he took this passion with him back to Winnipeg. And when Winnipeg needed a new manager in 1931, he volunteered and he started making changes. And the first thing he did was help to establish the Winnipeg Senior League with all these other teams. But he was also the driving force behind bringing the Americans up into Winnipeg. And also, he was a big voice. He kept pushing for, if not all of Canada, at least Western Canada, which the Western provinces rolled up into what was called the Western Canadian Rugby Football Union. So that was the west side of everything. pushing them to just go American intercollegiate rules. He was very frustrated with trying to make changes to the Canadian game and getting nowhere. And he just wanted them to just go all out on the American intercollegiate rules. But anyways, he helped over time make improvements to the local stadiums. And he was also, and I don't have direct evidence of this, but I can't imagine he wouldn't have a part in this. In that 1933, 34, I can't remember which season it was, but it was 1934 season, because the chapter is named Brown and Gold, and because that was the University of Manitoba's interesting season. And in that season, they hired a University of Minnesota Gophers coach named Wally Haas to come up and coach their team. And they scheduled a full-on American intercollegiate football schedule where they played American teams by only American rules. And but then they also played, because they were one of the senior teams in Winnipeg, they also played the Winnipeg club
to get its hands on American players. And when they did,
but he was
for the success of the club, how were they received by the community, the team, the league? I mean, how were Americans received up there for this?
They were actually pretty well received, at least by the people that were most interested in the rugby football. And so the crowds did increase with the arrival of the Americans. It could have been out of curiosity, right? Part of it also was the newspapers highly promoted the fact that, hey, we've got these Americans up here now, and all this. And so there was some more interest. But one of the things, when you talked about the crowds, one of the things that really showed up with the issue with the crowds was there was a couple of seasons there where they played the Regina Rough Riders in the semifinal of the West. They had a huge crowd for that game, like I spoke of before, but then they played Calgary in Winnipeg both times for the Western final, and they didn't get much of a crowd. And everyone was interested in Regina. And so they just didn't get the same crowd. So in other words, bringing up the Americans and having success in Winnipeg with that team in 1935, that's what turned things around in Winnipeg. And eventually, they moved into a new stadium.
Well, that 35 season,
and they outgrew that
obviously
stadium as well, because the team became very successful, very popular.
What was the outlook
starting with that
for the Winnipegs? Did anyone foresee what possibly was on the horizon for this team? I mean, no matter who the Winnipegs played, no matter what level of football it was, this team was unbeatable. Just how strong were the Winnipegs in 1935 going into that season?
I don't think that, except for maybe some of the promoters in Winnipeg, I don't think that outside of Winnipeg, they maybe thought they were going to be as successful as they were. One of the things to remember is that, yes, Winnipeg brought in and had a total of, I think it was 9 Americans on the team, but Regina had 8. And so Regina had already been bringing in more Americans than Winnipeg had been. But people forget that fact because it was Winnipeg that won the Grey Cup, because they had brought in Americans. But Regina was still looked to as the powerhouse. But then, people saw what Bob Fritz could do and what Fritz Hansen could do, what this whole team could do, especially with Bert Oja on the line there as the line coach. And he really got things moving well. And One of the things, Warren, that isn't mentioned very often, it's overlooked, though, that
Oh,
1935
interesting.
season, except for when they
Why was that?
left to go east to play for the Grey Cup, they played every game at home. Well, because in the Western semifinal and the final game, they would always alternate where it would happen. So in the Western semifinal game, it was always against the Manitoba versus Saskatchewan winner. And they would just alternate every year. And then at the top level, it was always against the Saskatchewan or Manitoba winner against the Alberta or British Columbia winner. And it just so happened that both of those games were scheduled to happen in Winnipeg that year. And so their entire season schedule was scheduled in Winnipeg because 3 of the games were against an upstart team, which was actually a resurrection team called the Winnipeg Victorias. 3 of the games were
Well,
there, but
certainly
then
an
all of the college
advantage
teams that they
for
played were
the
also brought up to
Winnipegs. And
Winnipeg.
like I
And
said
so, and then
earlier,
you
we
added the
can't
playoffs.
talk
Every
about
single
everything
game
in
was
your
played in
book,
Winnipeg.
Border Boys. I mean, you go into such great detail and you really do break it down each of those first couple of seasons for the Winnipegs. But we do need to talk about the payoff of the book, which was the Grey Cup and the Winnipegs becoming the first team from Western Canada to win it. So tell me about their opponent for the Grey Cup that year, Hamilton. Just how good a team was Hamilton, and just how dominant still at that point in time were Eastern Canadian teams.
Well, on the way to the Grey Cup, uh, it should be noted that Winnipeg did beat an Eastern team on their early schedule, and that was the Sarnia Imperials. And that event is
Wow.
significant because it was the first time any Western team had ever beaten any Eastern team at the senior level in any contest. And so right there, after that Sarnia game that people really took notice. And so then they made their way to the Grey Cup. And so Hamilton was a good team, but I think there was a little bit of overconfidence there. I mean, they had an American as their. I think he played the position of quarterback, and he would throw the ball and run the ball well. But they had some overconfidence, I think, because before the game, one of the gentlemen that was associated with the Winnipeg team had visited the ticket office, and a policeman had knocked on the door, and they let him in, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, here's one of our linemen or something," and it was a member of the Hamilton Tigers, and the guy was going to work the overnight shift the night before, and so he was going to work all night, and then he was going to play the game the next day, and so there was a lot of. They just didn't think the West could ever win a Grey Cup, I think is what it amounted to. So they were a good team, just like they had always been in Hamilton, but the overconfidence killed the day. But what really won it for Winnipeg that day was Fritz Hansen, and I don't want to discredit the work of some of the other players, because I think it's important for people to understand how Bob Fritz was the true leader of this team and really engineered the win, especially with a couple of special trick plays that he came up with after watching the Detroit Lions play the Brooklyn Dodgers of the NFL. But Fritz Hansen had the one run that just stunned everybody, and it was a kick return where he fielded the ball and he had 3 Hamilton players right on him. But at the time, and we still have that rule in the CFL where you have to give 5 yards cushion and let the returner catch the ball. But you have to remember there was a couple of things in play in that game that you don't see in American football. Well, one of them you do see, and that was the fact that the field was just icy. Okay, we had a really icy field, and so it's hard to run on an icy field, anyways. But the other thing that's in play is that the Winnipegs could not block for Fritz Hansen. There was no blocking on returns, and so Fritz Hansen's all by himself. It's one guy against 12, and so he fielded the ball. And somehow what he did is he bolted straight ahead, which the guys weren't expecting, apparently, because they were expecting him to juke or to make some kind of a move. But instead, he bolted straight ahead and just zipped straight down the field as fast as lightning. And it's just everybody else looked like they were sitting still or standing still. And he got that touchdown. And, afterward, he was asked about that, and he said, "Well, a runner has the advantage on an icy field," he said, because the runner knows where he's going to go.
Winnipeg rolled through that season. I mean, they were 10-0, outscored the opposition 210-31. They recorded 4 shutouts. They took on a team that really didn't seem to fear them. Hamilton really, I think, underestimated Winnipeg. And as you just alluded to just before, heck, they had guys working the night shift the day before the game because a team from Western Canada is not good enough to come here to our home turf. And because the game was played at Hamilton, Winnipeg doesn't have a chance to win this game. But they scored quickly. 15-yard touchdown pass. And they went up, I think, I could be wrong here, but they went up something like 5-0 on the touchdown. Is that correct? A touchdown was only worth 5 points?
Yeah, they still had the rugby scoring system, which of course, American football had up to a point where we still had 5-point
they
touchdowns.
Were up 5-0.
But Canadians,
Hamilton
they
cut
kept
the
that
lead 5-3 shortly
I don't
thereafter.
know. I think it might have been until
Winnipeg
the 1950s
scored on another touchdown pass in the first half to go up 12-4 because you have the Rouge into the half. I mean, really, Hamilton playing on its home turf never challenged. How shocking was this? What kind of team was Winnipeg?
Oh, well, Winnipeg, like I said before, had Bert Oja from Minnesota as their line coach. But he was also just a dominant presence on the line. And they were able to rush the Hamilton quarterback and keep him guessing. And one of the reasons for that is that Oja had scouted out Hamilton when Hamilton played Sarnia in the game leading up to the Grey Cup. And he watched them, and afterward, Oja said that I knew what they were going to do every single time. And so Oja was a pretty smart guy. The other reason is that, remember, the East, they were latecomers to adopting the pass or really embracing the pass in Canadian football. So it was the West that really took it up the most. And so they weren't as well versed in defending the pass as well. And that led to Bob Fritz being able to fake them out. Like I said before, he watched Detroit Lions play the Brooklyn Dodgers, and one of the things that they did in that game was something Bob Fritz had never seen before, and it was a pump fake. And Bob Fritz wrote up a couple variations of a play where took the ball back, did a pump fake to a receiver, and then pretended to run. But then the receiver would then start running downfield, right? Because the defenders would come back and pursue the run, and then he would just toss it, right, downfield and get a touchdown. And they did that twice, and so that's how they got 2 of their touchdowns, was on a
Interesting.
on a play that
Winnipeg
Bob Fritz
went
had
on to win that
seen
game
the Detroit Lions
18-12. In the
or
grand
performed in the
scheme
Detroit
of
Lions
things,
game.
how important for Canadian football was this win by the Winnipegs? Was it an important win? And without the American influence, could this have happened?
You know, it's interesting that you asked that question, because, the Canadian players on that team were the backbone of the team in a lot of ways. They made up half of the line, and in some of the games during the season, the Americans sat out the game and let the Canadian players play, and they actually did just as well or better. They had some superstars from Winnipeg, one of them named Tubber Kabrinski, who had played for the University of Manitoba, and he was kind of like a Fritz Hansen in the way he played. And so, you have to give credit to all of them. And so when they returned, to Winnipeg, the people in Winnipeg recognized that it wasn't just the Americans that won that game. There was plenty of Canadians on the team, and they had seen those Canadians play over the years, but it was the Americans that helped to push them over the top. And for Western Canada, it was huge because they had been fighting with the East for years. They had been promised, I think more than once leading up to this game, that yes, we'll play a Grey Cup in the West at some point. And the powers that be would renege on that promise, and then they would end up playing in the East at the expense of the West, of course, because they had to travel. And of course, the guys had to take time off from work, right? Because this wasn't their full-time job by any means. So for the West, it gave them credibility. It gave them standing.
Ryan, you certainly know your topic.
And it gave them more leverage in rules making and all that.
Were a definite, without a doubt, I mean, they were a contributor to the first ever Grey Cup championship won by a Western Canadian football team. What did you find most surprising, or what interested you? What did you find most surprising about the CFL, the Winnipegs, the Canadian brand of football during this time period?
Well, if you want to talk about the most surprising thing, to me it was the fact that they, up until I think it was 1933, they had a penalty box, just like they do in hockey, right? So if there could be a penalty against someone, usually it was for tackling somebody above the shoulders or the shoulders and above, something like that. And they called that scragging. And anyways, you could be put in the penalty box for a number of minutes. And the curious thing about this is that they had eliminated that penalty box, but during the 1935 Grey Cup, when the Winnipegs had committed a defensive penalty, at that time the referees weren't used to what to do in that situation when they were backed up near the goal line, like half the distance to the goal. So because they didn't know what to do, they said, well, let's just bring the penalty box back, even though it wasn't in the rules anymore. And they made Bert Oja sit out that next play. And of course, like I said, he kind of was the line, at least where he was. And sure enough, they ran right at the spot where he was no longer on the line, and Hamilton scored a touchdown. So if it hadn't been for that decision by the referees,
well, Ryan, your
bring
book,
back the penalty box all of a sudden,
book,
perhaps
really
there'd be
great
one less touchdown
retrospective
scored
on
by Hamilton.
the beginnings of the Winnipegs, or the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, the American influence on the game back then. I want to thank you so much for stopping by and taking some time to chat with me about this great time in Canadian football history. If somebody wants to grab a hold of your book, how do they get it?
Well, it's published on Amazon. So if you search for Border Boys on Amazon, you can find it in the books. But it's also through extended distribution. So I saw it was in Barnes & Noble and a bunch of other book sites. So you should be able to find it in those places as well. It helps if you can spell my last name correctly, which is Christiansen. But also, if you just go to borderboysbook.com, that's the website for the book. I'll post a link to this podcast later.
Awesome, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining me on
You can find out more information about the book there, and then you can also I appreciate it. You have a great podcast. You do a great service on that website.
Thank you. Over the course of their history, the Winnipegs, now the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, have appeared in the Grey Cup Championship game 15 times and have won it 9 times, including the most recent game, December 12, 2021, when they beat the Hamilton Tiger Cats 33-25. It was the second straight time Winnipeg beat Hamilton. The 2020 Grey Cup was canceled because of the pandemic. In 2019, the two teams met, and Winnipeg won that contest as well, 33-12. I'd like to thank my guest, RC Ryan Christiansen, again for spending so much time with us. If you are a fan of the Blue Bombers or the CFL, I strongly encourage you to get a copy of his book, Border Boys. You won't be disappointed. Hey, thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Be disappointed. Hey, thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorium Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.